The gravel crunched beneath Ilara's worn sneakers as she stood before the weathered gate of her grandmother's cottage. October in rural Vermont painted the landscape in muted golds and russets, but all she could see was the overwhelming tangle of green that had once been her grandmother's pride and joy. The garden sprawled wildly beyond the white picket fence, a chaotic mass of overgrown herbs, drooping flowers, and twisted vines that seemed to mock the careful order she remembered from her childhood visits. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, and the lawyer's keys felt heavy in her palm. The cottage itself looked smaller than her memories suggested, its blue shutters faded and one hanging askew, but it was the garden that made her chest tighten with grief. What had once been Grandma Rose's sanctuary now looked like nature's rebellion against human care. She always said the flowers would outlive us all, Ilara whispered to herself, her breath visible in the crisp morning air. The irony wasn't lost on her. The flowers had indeed outlived her grandmother, but in their wild state, they seemed more like a monument to loss than to life. She pushed through the gate, its hinges protesting with a familiar squeak that transported her back to summer afternoons when she was 8, racing through these same paths with grass-stained knees and pockets full of wildflower seeds. Her grandmother would watch from the kitchen window, her silver hair catching the sunlight, always ready with lemonade and stories about each plant's personality. The cottage door opened with surprising ease, and the scent hit her immediately. Lavender, dried roses, and that particular mustiness of old books. Everything was exactly as her grandmother had left it, down to the half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen table and the reading glasses perched on a well-worn gardening manual. Ilara's throat constricted as she noticed the pencil marks in the margins, her grandmother's careful handwriting noting bloom times and companion plantings. From the kitchen window, the garden looked even more overwhelming. What had seemed like wild abandonment from the street revealed itself as something more complex up close. There was a strange intentionality to the chaos, patterns that her eye couldn't quite grasp, but somehow sensed. A cluster of tall sunflowers dominated the center, their heavy heads all turned toward the cottage. Surrounding them, waves of different flowers created natural pathways that curved and intersected like a living maze. She found herself drawn to the back door, where her grandmother's gardening boots still sat caked with Vermont soil. The sight of them, so small, so empty, finally broke the dam she'd built around her grief. Tears came freely as she slumped into her grandmother's favorite rocking chair on the back porch, surrounded by hanging baskets of herbs that somehow still thrived despite weeks of neglect. "I don't know what to do with all this, Grandma," she said aloud, feeling foolish but needing to voice the overwhelm that had been building since the diagnosis, through the final months of care, and into this hollow aftermath. The garden seemed to rustle in response to her voice, though there was barely a breeze. The neighbors had been kind but clear in their suggestions. "Such a shame to let it go wild like that," Mrs. Henderson from next door had said at the funeral reception. "Rose had such a green thumb, but toward the end, well, you know how it gets. Probably best to clear it all out and start fresh." Others had nodded in agreement, speaking in hushed tones about property values and the practical difficulties of maintaining such an elaborate garden. But sitting there in her grandmother's chair, watching the late afternoon light filter through the overgrown apple trees, Ilara found herself reluctant to dismiss what her grandmother had spent decades creating. There was something here, something she was missing. Her grandmother had never done anything without purpose, had never planted a seed without considering its place in the larger design of her world. As the sun began to set, painting the garden in golden light, Ilara noticed something that made her sit up straighter. Near the old oak tree that had served as the garden's anchor for as long as she could remember, a perfect circle of small blue flowers created a natural wreath around a single yellow rosebush. The formation was too precise to be accidental, too purposeful to be random. Rising from the chair, she stepped down into the garden, following a barely visible path between the plants. The closer she looked, the more she noticed, the way certain flowers seemed to point toward others, The deliberate spacing between different varieties, the careful attention to height and color that created natural focal points throughout the space. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. The flowers listen, Ilara, and they always respond. At the time, she'd thought it was just her grandmother's fanciful way of talking about gardening, the kind of gentle anthropomorphizing that made plants seem like friends rather than mere decorations. But now, standing in the gathering dusk with the scent of late-blooming roses heavy in the air, Ilara wondered if there had been more truth in those words than she'd ever understood. Chapter 2. The language beneath Ilara woke on the cottage sofa at dawn, her neck stiff from an uncomfortable night, but her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. Through the front windows, morning light revealed the garden with startling clarity, and what she saw made her catch her breath. The pattern she'd noticed the evening before wasn't isolated. It was everywhere. She made coffee in her grandmother's kitchen, using the same blue ceramic mug she'd claimed as hers during childhood visits, and carried it outside. The October air was sharp and clean, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and late-season blooms. With the systematic approach that had served her well in her career as a data analyst, she began to walk the garden methodically, noting what she saw. The circle of blue flowers, she was almost certain they were forget-me-nots, formed a perfect ring around the yellow rosebush. From there, a subtle path of what looked like rosemary plants led toward a weathered wooden bench that sat beneath the old apple tree. The placement seemed deliberate, each plant carefully spaced to create a natural walkway. But it was when she sat on that bench, in the spot where she'd spent countless afternoons listening to her grandmother's stories, that the real revelation began. From this vantage point, the entire garden revealed itself as something far more complex than random plantings. Clusters of red poppies near the cottage's back door, bright yellow daffodils marking the corners of what might be considered rooms in this outdoor space, and everywhere, the careful interplay of colors and textures that spoke of decades of thoughtful cultivation. She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures, trying to capture the patterns that were becoming more obvious with each passing moment. This wasn't the work of someone whose mind had been failing in her final years. This was the masterpiece of someone who had been planning something extraordinary. Back inside the cottage, Ilara found herself drawn to her grandmother's study, a small room lined floor to ceiling with gardening books, botanical guides, and journals filled with her grandmother's meticulous handwriting. She'd always known her grandmother was knowledgeable about plants, but the scope of the library was staggering. Books on medicinal herbs sat next to volumes on garden design, while field guides to native Vermont plants shared shelf space with texts on the history of botanical illustration. It was while pulling down a particularly worn volume on perennial gardens that she discovered the slim book that would change everything. Tucked between larger texts, its spine cracked and faded, was a small volume titled The Language of Flowers, a Victorian guide to floral communication. Ilara's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, immediately recognizing her grandmother's pencil marks throughout the margins. The concept was simple yet profound. In Victorian times, when direct expression of emotion was often considered inappropriate, people had developed an elaborate code using flowers to convey messages that couldn't be spoken aloud. Each flower, each color, each combination carried specific meaning. A red rose meant passionate love, but a yellow rose spoke of friendship and joy. Forget-me-nots were a plea for remembrance, while rosemary symbolized memory itself. Page after page revealed a complex vocabulary of botanical communication, and with growing excitement, Ilara began to match what she'd seen in the garden with the meanings described in the book. The forget-me-nots around the yellow rosebush suddenly made perfect sense. "Don't forget our friendship," the combination seemed to say. The rosemary path leading to their special bench was a trail of memories, guiding her to the place where they'd shared their most important conversations. She spent the rest of the morning moving between the book and the garden, her excitement building with each connection she made. The red poppies by the back door, according to the guide, meant consolation in grief. The bright yellow daffodils that marked the garden's boundaries were symbols of new beginnings and rebirth. Even the placement of the sunflowers, always turned toward the cottage windows, took on new meaning when she read that they represented devotion and adoration. By afternoon, she was certain she was right. Her grandmother hadn't let the garden grow wild in her final years. She had been composing something, but what was the message she was trying to send? The answer began to emerge as Ilara plotted the garden's layout on paper, marking each significant planting with its Victorian meaning. What emerged wasn't random at all. It was a letter written in living things, designed to bloom and reveal itself at exactly the moment when Ilara would need it most. The path began at the front gate with white lilies, symbolizing rebirth and renewal after death. It wound through clusters of purple violets for faithfulness, past beds of pink carnations representing a mother's undying love. Her grandmother had been more mother than grandmother since Ilara's parents died in a car accident when she was 12. The trail of meaning led inevitably to the garden's heart, where that circle of forget-me-nots surrounded not just any rosebush, but one planted in the exact spot where her grandmother used to sit on warm summer evenings, watching Ilara play among the flowers. As the sun began to set on her second day at the cottage, Ilara found herself sitting in that same spot, surrounded by the living words her grandmother had spent years cultivating. The message was becoming clear, but she sensed there was still more to discover, more layers to this extraordinary gift that had grown silently, season after season, waiting for her to find the key to its meaning. The flowers rustled in the evening breeze, and for the first time since her grandmother's death, Ilara felt something other than grief. She felt wonder. Chapter 3. Messages in Bloom. The third morning brought an unexpected visitor. Ilara was kneeling beside a patch of herbs, cross-referencing their meanings in her grandmother's flower language book when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. She looked up to see Margaret Chen, her grandmother's longtime neighbor and closest friend, approaching with a thermos of coffee and a concerned expression. "I saw the lights on late last night," Margaret said, settling onto the garden bench with the careful movements of someone in her 70s. "Rose told me you might need some guidance when you found her project." Ilara sat back on her heels, dirt-stained hands clutching the worn book. "You knew about this?" Margaret's smile was warm but tinged with sadness. "Child, I helped her plan some of it. Your grandmother started this garden the day after your first visit here, when you were 8 years old. She said she wanted to make sure you'd always have her words, even when she couldn't speak them anymore." The revelation hit Ilara like a physical force. 20 years. Her grandmother had been writing this message for 20 years. "She made me promise not to interfere, not to explain until you discovered it on your own," Margaret continued, pouring coffee from the thermos into 2 cups she'd brought. "Rose was very specific about that. She said the discovery had to be yours, or the message wouldn't mean what it was supposed to mean." Over the next hour, Margaret filled in pieces of the story that made Ilara's throat tight with emotion. How her grandmother had researched Victorian flower language for months before planting the first seeds. How she'd spent winters planning new additions, always considering how each plant would contribute to the overall message. How she'd tended the garden through arthritis pain in her final years, determined to complete what she'd started. "She was so worried about the timing," Margaret said. "What if the plants didn't bloom right? What if you came in the wrong season?" But she had faith that everything would work out as it was meant to. Armed with this new understanding, Ilara approached the garden with fresh eyes. What she found took her breath away. The message wasn't just about individual plant meanings. It was about timing, about the way different flowers bloomed in sequence throughout the growing season, creating a narrative that unfolded month by month. She traced the timeline in her grandmother's journals, finding careful notes about which flowers would bloom, how the message would change and develop as spring moved into summer and then fall. The early spring crocuses spelled out hope returns, while late summer's gladioli proclaimed strength of character. The fall chrysanthemums that were blooming now carried messages of honor and devotion. But it was when she discovered the winter plantings that Ilara truly understood the scope of her grandmother's vision. Even in the dormant season, there were messages to be found in the evergreen arrangements, in the placement of plants that would survive the Vermont winter. Holly for foresight, ivy for fidelity, winter jasmine for grace and elegance even in difficult times. The garden was designed to speak to her year-round, a constant companion that would offer different wisdom as seasons and circumstances changed. It was brilliant, it was heartbreaking, and it was so perfectly like her grandmother that Ilara found herself laughing and crying at the same time. Margaret helped her map out the complete message, pointing out subtleties that only someone who'd known her grandmother intimately would catch. The way certain plants were positioned to catch morning light, because her grandmother knew Ilara was always an early riser. The placement of the herb garden near the kitchen window, where the scents would drift inside during cooking, a reminder of all the meals they'd shared together. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as the afternoon shadows grew longer. She led Ilara to a section of the garden she hadn't fully explored yet, behind the old tool shed. There, in a sheltered spot protected from wind and weather, grew a small but thriving patch of pansies. In the Victorian flower language, pansies meant thoughts. But these weren't just any pansies. They were arranged to spell out words, their purple and yellow faces carefully positioned to form letters that could be read from above. Standing on the old wooden step stool that her grandmother had kept nearby, Ilara could make out the message clearly. "My darling granddaughter, bloom where you are planted." It was her grandmother's favorite saying, the word she'd offered whenever Ilara faced disappointment or uncertainty. Find a way to thrive wherever life takes you. Make beauty from whatever circumstances you find yourself in. Don't wait for perfect conditions to become who you're meant to be. The message hit home with particular force because Ilara realized how much she'd been drifting lately. How she'd been going through the motions of her life in Boston without really engaging, without really blooming. Her corporate job felt meaningless, her relationships superficial. She'd been existing rather than living, and somehow her grandmother had known that this moment of loss might also be a moment of possibility. As evening approached, Margaret gathered her things to leave, but not before offering one final piece of the puzzle. "She wanted you to know that the garden isn't finished," she said. "Rose always planned for it to grow and change. She said you'd know what to add, what to change, how to make it yours while keeping the love that started it." Standing alone in the garden as darkness fell, surrounded by the rustling whispers of plants that carried 20 years of accumulated love and wisdom, Ilara felt something shift inside her chest. The grief was still there, would always be there. But it was no longer the only thing she felt. Wonder was there too, and gratitude, and something that might have been hope. Tomorrow, she decided, she would start learning what other messages the garden might have to tell her. Dies Chapter 4, The Garden's New Voice. 6 months later, on a bright April morning, Ilara knelt in the Vermont soil of her grandmother's garden, now her garden, carefully planting a new section she'd been planning through the long winter months. The forget-me-nots were blooming again, their blue faces turned toward the strengthening sun, and the yellow rosebush at the garden's heart was heavy with buds that would open within days. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. After discovering her grandmother's floral message in October, Ilara had returned to Boston with every intention of settling her grandmother's estate and moving on with her life, as planned. But the garden had changed something fundamental in how she saw the world, how she understood what really mattered. The corporate job that had once provided stability now felt like a prison. Her downtown apartment, with its carefully curated but soulless decor, seemed to mock the authentic beauty she'd experienced among her grandmother's flowers. Most painfully, she'd realized how disconnected she'd become from the people and places that actually brought meaning to her life. The decision to leave Boston and move permanently to Vermont had surprised everyone, including herself. Her colleagues thought she was having some kind of breakdown, throwing away a successful career to become a gardener in the middle of nowhere. Even Margaret had gently questioned whether she was making such a dramatic change for the right reasons. But as Ilara settled into the rhythm of small-town life, as she spent the winter months reading her grandmother's journals and learning everything she could about the Victorian language of flowers, she knew she'd made the right choice. She'd found freelance work as a data analyst that she could do remotely, giving her the flexibility to tend the garden while maintaining her financial independence. More importantly, she'd found her purpose. The new section she was planting would be visible from the road, a public part of the private message her grandmother had created. She'd chosen flowers that would bloom in succession throughout the summer, creating a display that would bring beauty to everyone who passed by, while adding her own voice to her grandmother's ongoing conversation. White daisies for new beginnings surrounded cheerful orange marigolds for passion and creativity. Purple lupins reached toward the sky, their spires representing imagination and happiness, while soft pink sweet peas promised departure and goodbye, not in sadness, but in gratitude for what had been and excitement for what was coming. It was her message to her grandmother, written in the same living language that had brought them together across the divide between life and death. Thank you. I understand now. I'm blooming where I'm planted. Margaret appeared around the corner of the cottage, carrying her morning coffee and wearing the kind of smile that had become familiar over the past months. Pride, mixed with gentle amusement at the intensity with which Ilara had thrown herself into gardening. "The town council approved your proposal," Margaret said, settling onto the bench that had become their usual meeting spot. "They're excited about the community garden project." Ilara sat back on her heels, wiping soil from her hands. The community garden had been her idea, inspired by the realization that her grandmother's gift was too beautiful and meaningful to keep entirely to herself. Working with the town, she'd proposed creating a public space where people could plant their own messages using the Victorian flower language, where the elderly could share their knowledge with children, where the ancient art of communicating through flowers could live on in a new generation. "Mrs. Patterson wants to dedicate a section to her late husband," Margaret continued, "and the elementary school teacher is planning to bring her students to learn about the flowers. You've started something special here, Ilara." The truth was, Ilara hadn't started anything. She'd simply continued what her grandmother had begun. But she was learning that continuation could be just as creative and meaningful as creation itself. Each new plant she added to the garden, each person she taught about flower meanings, each moment of beauty she cultivated was part of an ongoing conversation that stretched backward to her grandmother and forward to future generations who would find their own messages in the blooming words. Her phone buzzed with a text from her old boss in Boston, asking if she was ready to come to her senses and return to the city. Ilara smiled and put the phone away without responding. She had more important conversations to tend to. As the morning warmed, she moved to the herb garden, where new growth was pushing through the soil with the unstoppable energy of spring. The rosemary had survived the winter beautifully, its woody stems now showing fresh green tips. Remembrance, it meant in the flower language. But Ilara had learned that remembrance wasn't about living in the past. It was about carrying the best of what came before into whatever came next. She thought about the notebook she'd started keeping, documenting the garden's changes through the seasons, recording the meanings of new plants she added, noting which combinations seemed to work best. Future generations would find it alongside her grandmother's journals. Another voice added to the chorus of women who tended this space and found meaning in its beauty. The yellow rosebush was opening its first blooms of the season, filling the air with the sweet scent that would forever remind her of summer afternoons spent listening to her grandmother's stories. But now she had stories of her own to tell, about the winter she'd spent learning to identify plants by their dormant forms, about the morning she'd discovered that the garden attracted more species of birds than any other yard in the neighborhood, about the day she'd realized she was happier than she'd been in years. As afternoon approached, bringing with it the first tour group she'd agreed to guide through the garden, Ilara stood at the front gate and looked back at the space that had transformed her life. The forget-me-nots and yellow roses were blooming together, just as they had the previous fall when she'd first understood her grandmother's message. But now she saw them differently, not just as a plea to remember, but as a promise that love, once planted, continues to grow and bloom in ways the original gardener never could have imagined. The flowers listened, her grandmother had always said, and they always responded. Standing there in the morning light, surrounded by the rustling whispers of a garden that spoke in the ancient language of growing things, Ilara finally understood what that meant. The garden wasn't just responding to her grandmother's care, it was responding to all the love and attention that had been given to it over the years, blooming into something larger and more beautiful than any single person could have created alone. She was part of that conversation now, adding her own words to the ongoing message. And someday, perhaps, someone else would stand where she stood, discovering their own meaning in the flowers that listened and always responded.